My name is Margaret Hayes. I am 68 years old, a retired school teacher, and a widow for nearly 10 years. I live alone in the house my husband Richard and I built together. To many, it is just a mansion. To me, it is the vessel of a lifetime. Every brick carries the weight of the years we shared. Every room still holds his laughter and his silence. 3 days before my son's wedding, I was standing in the sunlit hallway, watching florists measure the archway. My daughter-in-law to be, Angela, walked over with her perfect hair and steady eyes. She leaned close, so that only I could hear. "This $5 million mansion will be ours soon. You should stay out of sight. The greatest gift would be if you disappeared from our family." I felt the words slice through me like cold steel. For a moment, the floor seemed to tilt under my feet. The house itself felt offended, as if the walls heard her and shivered. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around the handle of my porcelain teacup. The small crack on its side pressed into my skin, a reminder of how fragile things can appear and how strong they can remain. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not just a young woman excited about her wedding, but someone rehearsed in power, someone convinced that money and possession could erase history, love, and sacrifice. She did not flinch. She did not lower her voice. She wanted me to know exactly where I stood, outside of my own life. I said nothing. Not because I agreed and not because I was afraid. I said nothing because silence has always been my first defense. As a teacher, as a wife, as a mother, I had learned that quiet could carry more weight than shouting ever could. Silence was my shield when words would have betrayed me. She walked away before the florists even noticed us. She laughed lightly, pointing to fabrics and flowers, as if she had not just erased me with a sentence. My son, David, followed her across the room. He smiled nervously at me, but his eyes avoided mine. In that instant, I realized he had heard her too. And worse, he had chosen not to defend me. The mansion was no longer just a house preparing for a wedding. It had become a battlefield, and I was not invited to fight. That night, I sat by the window with the same cracked teacup, watching the garden Richard once planted. I thought of every morning he kissed my hand before leaving for work, of every evening we counted the stars through this very glass. Angela's words echoed inside me, sharp and merciless. "Disappear. Stay out of sight." But as I placed the cup down gently on its saucer, I whispered to myself, silence is not weakness, it is power. In that silence, a memory returned. Richard's voice the day he signed his last will, saying to me, "One day, Margaret, this house will be your strength, not your burden." I had not understood then, but now, with the weight of my daughter-in-law's disdain pressing on my chest, I began to. I did not sleep that night. I walked from room to room, touching the wooden banisters, the faded photographs, the heavy curtains. I asked myself if disappearing was really the greatest gift, or if perhaps the greater gift was to stay, quietly, and hold the line where love had been built. Angela believed my silence meant surrender. She did not yet understand that silence can also mean strategy. That night, as the moonlight stretched across the marble floor, I promised Richard and myself that I would not vanish. If I must disappear, then so would the mansion. And that was something Angela had not planned for. I closed the window, turned off the lamp, and set the cracked teacup on the bedside table. It stood there like a companion, imperfect but unbroken, just like me. This is not the story of a woman erased. This is the story of how silence turned into strength and how I changed everything. The morning after Angela's words, I walked through the mansion as if tracing the lines of an old map. Each room told a story. Each corridor carried the echo of laughter, arguments, reconciliations, and quiet evenings. I could not look at a single corner without remembering Richard. We were only 24 when we bought the land. Back then, it was nothing but soil and scattered stones, a field no one wanted. He saw potential where others saw emptiness. I remember the day we laid the first brick. Richard placed my hand on top of his and whispered, "This house will be more than walls. It will be a promise." I believed him. We built slowly, year by year, paycheck by paycheck. I taught school children during the day while he worked double shifts at the factory. At night, we saved every dollar in a tin box under our bed. On weekends, we laid tiles, planted trees, and painted walls until our fingers blistered. The house grew alongside our marriage, a silent witness to our struggles and small victories. When David was born, the house became a cradle. His cries echoed down the long hallway, and I would pace back and forth, rocking him until he fell asleep. Richard built a swing set in the backyard with his own hands. Every Sunday morning, the smell of pancakes filled the kitchen. There were seasons when the roof leaked and winters when the heater broke, but somehow we always managed. Every crack and imperfection became part of our history. I stopped in the dining room and ran my hand across the table. How many birthdays had we celebrated here? How many times had I wiped away David's tears after a failed exam or stitched his torn jacket before school? I could still hear his laughter when he was small, the way he begged Richard for one more story before bed. My throat tightened. Where had that boy gone? How had he become the man who looked away when Angela told me to disappear? I paused at the staircase. Richard used to sit on the second step, polishing his shoes before work. I used to tease him about how serious he looked, as though preparing for a battle. He would smile and say, "Life is a battle, Maggie, but you fight it with steadiness, not with noise." That steadiness had carried me through decades of marriage, through sickness, through his final days. When cancer took him, it was here, in this house, that he asked me to promise I would not let anyone take away what we had built. I can still see him lying in the upstairs bedroom, pale but calm. He took my hand and said, "This home is your strength now. Don't let anyone turn it into your prison." At the time, I thought he was just easing my fears. Now, with Angela's cold words echoing, I realized he had been preparing me. I walked into the study, where his books still lined the shelves. Dust had settled on the spines, but his notes were still in the margins. He loved writing small reminders to himself. On one page, I found his handwriting. "Silence is a language, too." I closed the book and pressed it against my chest. By the time the sun climbed higher, the mansion no longer felt like just walls under siege. It felt like an ally, a partner. Every scar in the wood, every stain on the floor reminded me that this was not Angela's stage. It was my life's witness. I poured tea into my cracked cup and carried it out to the garden. The roses Richard planted were blooming again. I sat on the bench he built and let the steam rise into the morning air. My silence was heavy, yes, but it was not empty. It was full of memory, of vows, of resilience. Angela could plan her wedding here, parade her guests, and call it hers. But I knew the truth. This mansion was not a trophy. It was my story carved into stone. and I was not ready to vanish from it. That afternoon, I decided to make lunch the way I used to when David was a boy. I cooked his favorite chicken pot pie, the one with thyme and carrots, hoping the smell might bring back something familiar, something tender. The kitchen filled with warmth and memory. When David walked in, his face lit up for a second, just like it used to. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the light dimmed. Angela stepped in behind him, her hand wrapped tightly around his arm. "Smells nice, Mom," he said, not meeting my eyes. He kissed my cheek lightly, as though I were an acquaintance, not the woman who raised him. Angela scanned the kitchen with sharp eyes, already calculating what would change once the wedding was over. We sat down at the table. I placed the pie in the center, steam rising into the air. I asked David about his work, about his health, about anything that might pull him back into conversation with me. His answers were short. Angela filled the silences with talk about the wedding, her dress fittings, the guest list, the champagne she had ordered. She spoke of it all as though the mansion were already signed over to her. At one point, she reached for David's hand and said, "It will be perfect. Our first real celebration in our house." The words stung, but what cut deeper was David's silence. He didn't correct her. He didn't remind her whose house it truly was. He just nodded, eyes fixed on his plate. I excused myself to the pantry to steady my breath. I pressed my hand against the shelf and whispered to myself, "Hold steady. Don't fight noise with noise." When I returned, I carried the cracked teacup in my hand, sipping slowly, letting it anchor me. After lunch, Angela suggested they move a few pieces of furniture. Without asking me, she called in 2 men to measure the living room for a new chandelier. They stepped across my rug with muddy shoes, talking loudly about timelines and budgets. I watched as the home Richard and I built was treated like a stage prop. David stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets, shifting uncomfortably. I waited for him to speak, to draw a line. He never did. Instead, when I asked softly, "David, do you really think this is necessary?" he avoided my gaze. "Mom," he said, his voice almost rehearsed, "maybe it's easier if you let Angela handle things. She knows what she's doing. It's just one day. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." Those words hit me harder than Angela's command to disappear. My own son, the boy who once clung to my hand when he was afraid of thunder, was now asking me to step aside in silence. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a rewriting of loyalty. Angela smiled at him, a quick flicker of triumph. She had what she wanted, his compliance. My throat tightened, but I said nothing. I let the silence fill the room, heavy and sharp. Later, I walked into the backyard to breathe. The swing Richard built for David still hung from the oak tree. Rust had eaten at the chains, but it swayed slightly in the breeze. I remembered David's laughter there, how he begged for one more push. I remembered the nights Richard and I sat on the porch, watching him swing higher and higher. Those memories felt like ghosts now, drifting through a house that no longer recognized me. As the sun dipped low, I understood something painful. Angela's ambition was sharp, but David's silence was sharper. One wounded with words, the other with absence. Between the two of them, I was being erased. And yet, as I sipped again from the cracked teacup, I reminded myself, silence is not surrender. It is the pause before choosing how to act. 2 days later, I woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices echoing through the mansion. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw strangers carrying swatches of fabric, tape measures, and clipboards. They were moving with authority, as though this house already belonged to them. Angela followed behind, pointing to walls, waving her hands with the confidence of someone who believed ownership was just a matter of time. "Take down these curtains," she ordered. "Replace them with ivory silk. And the chairs in the dining room. Too old, too dark. I want something brighter, more modern." I stood at the bottom of the staircase, still in my robe, watching them strip away the layers of memory Richard and I had built. Each instruction she gave was like peeling my life from the walls. The velvet curtains Richard saved for months to buy. The oak chairs he sanded by hand, all dismissed as if they were nothing more than clutter in a showroom. "Angela," I said quietly, "those curtains were Richard's favorite. He chose them himself." She turned her head, eyes sharp, but her smile perfectly rehearsed. "I understand, Margaret. But this isn't about the past. This is about creating a future that reflects us." Her tone made it clear. Us did not include me. The men began unhooking the curtains. I wanted to shout, to tell them to stop, but my voice froze. Instead, I wrapped my robe tighter around me and held my cracked teacup close. I sipped slowly, the bitterness of the tea cutting through the dryness in my throat. David walked in then, adjusting his tie. He glanced at the workers, then at me. For a moment, guilt flickered across his face. But when Angela slipped her arm through his, he straightened. "Mom," he said carefully, "it's just temporary. After the wedding, we'll put things back. Angela just wants the place to look perfect." I searched his eyes for the boy I once knew, the boy who ran through these halls with muddy shoes, who hid under this staircase during thunderstorms. All I found was hesitation. He looked away before I could answer. The workers moved to the dining room. One of them tapped the table, asking Angela if she wanted it replaced too. She laughed lightly and said, "Oh no, this will do, at least until we buy something better." Buy something better. As though Richard's hands had not polished this wood, as though the meals served here were not carved into its surface. I pressed my palm against the wall to steady myself. My silence filled the room, thick and unyielding. When they left that evening, the house felt foreign. The familiar drapes were gone, the furniture shifted. Even the scent was different, replaced by perfume samples Angela had sprayed to freshen the air. I walked from room to room, touching bare walls and displaced chairs, as though searching for proof that my life had once filled this place. In the study, I opened Richard's old desk. Inside lay a stack of his letters, tied with twine. I untied one and read his handwriting. "This house will always be yours, Maggie. Don't let the world convince you otherwise." The tears came then, uninvited. I pressed the letter to my lips and whispered back to him, "They think they can erase me, but you knew better." That night, as I sat with my cracked teacup, the mansion no longer felt safe. It felt invaded, rewritten. Yet, beneath the hurt, a quiet resolve began to stir. Angela saw me as fragile, as outdated. David saw me as inconvenient. But Richard had seen me as strong, steady, capable. And I realized his vision of me was the only one I was willing to carry forward. The house was being stripped, yes, but so was I. Stripped of illusions, stripped of the belief that silence alone would protect me. Something within me was shifting. Something that Angela could not measure with her tape or replace with her silk. The following evening, The house was alive with voices. Angela had invited a handful of her friends to preview the venue. I watched from the corner of the living room as they strolled through the mansion, wine glasses in hand, laughing as if they already owned every inch of it. Their heels clicked against the wooden floors Richard once polished until his back ached. Angela led them with the flair of a hostess. "The ceremony will be right here," she said, gesturing toward the grand staircase. "Can you imagine the photos? It will look like a royal wedding." Her friends clapped and gasped, their eyes roaming over chandeliers and crown molding, as though they were cataloging my life for resale. One of them asked, "Will Margaret be part of the ceremony?" Angela's lips curved into a smile that was almost kind, but her voice carried a sting. "Of course not. She'll just observe quietly. It's better this way. Too many cooks spoil the broth, you know." Laughter rippled across the room. The words burned, but I held my teacup close, letting the warmth settle my trembling hands. I thought about Richard again. How he used to say, "Don't let cruelty turn you cruel." I stayed quiet, but inside, the silence grew heavier, denser, like a storm waiting for its moment. Later that night, after the guests left, Angela found me in the kitchen. The dishes were still on the counter, the scent of perfume still hanging in the air. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, her smile gone. "Let's be honest, Margaret," she began, her voice low and deliberate. "This wedding is about David and me. You've had your time here, but now it's our turn. The greatest gift you could give us is to disappear. Do you understand? Not just from the wedding, from this house, from this family." The words landed like a blade pressed against my skin, sharp, deliberate, cutting straight to the bone. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I remembered giving birth to David in this very house, remembered the night Richard carried me over the threshold, remembered the countless meals, lessons, and prayers offered within these walls. To her, it all meant nothing. I wanted to speak, to tell her this house was not hers to claim. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came. Instead, I stared at her, the silence between us louder than any words I could have spoken. She mistook it for surrender. She tilted her head and smiled again, satisfied. When she left the room, I leaned against the sink, gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. My reflection in the window looked older, smaller, almost defeated. But then I noticed the crack in my teacup glowing faintly in the kitchen light. It reminded me of myself, flawed, weathered, but unbroken. The silence that night was painful, yes, but it was also purposeful. Because deep within me, something had begun to shift. I was not disappearing. I was listening, watching, waiting. I poured what was left of my tea down the sink and rinsed the cup carefully, setting it on the counter like a relic. My heart was heavy, but not hollow. I carried Angela's words with me, each syllable etched into my memory. They hurt, but they also lit a spark. When I lay down to sleep, I whispered Richard's name. I told him what Angela had said, and I asked him for strength. The house was quiet, but I felt his presence. It was in the creak of the floorboards, in the soft rustle of the curtains. His voice echoed faintly in my mind. "This house is your strength now. Don't let them erase you." And so, even as Angela's cruelty sliced through me, I realized something vital. The blade had cut deep, but it had also awakened a part of me I had long forgotten. A steadiness, a resilience, a truth that silence was not the absence of power, it was the preparation for it. That night, after Angela's blade of words, I could not sleep. The house felt different, as though her laughter had stained the walls. Every shadow seemed heavier, every silence sharper. I walked the halls in darkness, my hand brushing along the banister Richard once polished. The mansion groaned with old wood and memory, reminding me that I was not alone, not truly. I found myself drawn to the study, the place Richard loved most. The lamp on the desk flickered weakly when I turned it on, casting long shapes across the shelves. His books were still there, lined neatly in the order he preferred. The smell of leather and dust clung to the air. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk. It stuck at first, as if it, too, had decided to resist. When it finally slid open, I saw an envelope, thick and yellowed with time, tied with a thin piece of twine. My breath caught. On the front, written in Richard's hand, was my name. My fingers trembled as I untied the twine. Inside, there were letters, several, folded carefully. On the top was one I had never seen before. I unfolded it, the paper crackling softly, and read his words. Margaret, if you are reading this, I am gone. I have done what I can to ensure you are safe. I asked Robert to keep copies of everything, just in case. Remember, this home is not just stone and wood. It is your life's work too. No one can take it from you without your consent. Trust the law, but more importantly, trust yourself. I pressed the letter to my chest. For the first time in days, I felt something other than despair. I felt Richard's presence, his steadiness guiding me even now. My tears spilled freely, but they did not weaken me. They cleansed me. Beneath the letter, I found documents, old property deeds, legal notes with Robert's handwriting. I traced the ink with my fingers, each word a shield Richard had left behind. Angela's ambition suddenly seemed smaller, less invincible. She thought my silence was surrender. She had no idea silence could also be strategy. I sat back in the chair, staring at the crack in my teacup resting on the desk. It caught the lamplight, glowing faintly like a scar that refuses to fade. I thought of all the scars I carried: loss, sacrifice, betrayal. And yet, like that cup, I remained whole. Outside, the night was still. I could hear the wind brushing against the windows, the distant hum of the city. My body ached with age, with grief, with exhaustion, but my spirit felt steadier. For years, I had lived quietly, teaching children, raising David, tending to Richard. I had asked for so little. Now, in this moment of loneliness, I realized I was ready to ask for something. Not for revenge, not even for recognition, but for respect, for dignity. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow, I would visit Robert. Tomorrow, I would remind Angela and David that this house was not theirs to claim. Not yet, not ever without me. I blew out the lamp and sat for a long while in the dark, listening to the house breathe. It was no longer just my prison. It was my ally. And together, we would endure. When I finally lay down to rest, I whispered into the silence, "I am still here, Richard, and I will not disappear." The next morning, I dressed carefully. I chose a navy dress Richard had always admired, plain but strong, and I carried the envelope with me as if it were a living thing. My steps down the front stairs echoed louder than usual, each one reminding me that I was still here. Angela was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she was out with the planner, ordering more pieces of her dream. I did not tell her where I was going. Some journeys require silence. Robert Sterling's office sat on the corner of Main Street, above a small bookstore that smelled of ink and dust. I had known Robert for decades. He and Richard had been friends since college, bound together not just by law, but by trust. As I climbed the narrow staircase, I wondered if Robert still remembered the promise he made to Richard on his deathbed. He looked older when I entered, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He rose slowly and opened his arms, greeting me not as a client, but as family. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm with recognition. "It's been too long. What brings you here?" I placed the envelope on his desk and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. "Angela," I whispered. "She's planning her wedding in my home. She told me the greatest gift I could give was to disappear. I need to know what Richard left me, truly left me." Robert's expression darkened. He untied the envelope, skimming the papers with the care of a man who knew how much weight words could carry. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "Richard was thorough," he said. "He knew there might come a time when you would be tested. He added a clause to the deed. No event, no transfer, no sale of the mansion can take place without your signature. Not David's, not Angela's, yours alone." My heart pounded. Relief and sorrow tangled inside me. Richard had prepared for this, had thought ahead to protect me even when I did not think to protect myself. "Angela doesn't know," I murmured. "No," Robert said firmly. "And she doesn't need to. Not until the time is right. Margaret, the law is on your side. But more than that, Richard's faith is on your side. He wanted you to stand tall." I stared at the crack in my teacup, now sitting on Robert's desk beside the papers. It had traveled with me like an anchor. My reflection curved along its surface. For the first time, I saw not weakness, but resilience staring back. Robert leaned forward. "You have choices, Margaret. You could confront them now, wave these papers in their faces. Or you could wait, hold your silence, and let them reveal themselves. Sometimes timing is the sharpest weapon." His words sank into me. Silence again. Always silence. But this time, not as retreat. Silence as preparation. I thanked Robert and tucked the envelope back into my bag. As I rose to leave, he touched my hand gently. "Richard believed in you. Don't forget that. And don't let anyone make you vanish." The bookstore downstairs smelled sweet as I descended. I paused at the doorway, breathing in the scent of printed pages, the weight of stories stacked on shelves. Stories endure, I thought, just as houses endure, just as I endure. On the walk home, the sun was sharp, casting long shadows. I felt them at my back. Angela's ambition, David's silence, society's dismissal of women my age. But ahead of me, the road gleamed. My steps grew steadier. By the time I reached the mansion, I was ready. Angela might believe she held the stage, but she had never read the script Richard and I had written together. And in that script, I was not erased. I was the cornerstone. When I returned home from Robert's office, I closed the heavy front door behind me and let the echo settle through the halls. The mansion felt quieter than usual, but not empty. It was listening. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table, laying it down beside my cracked teacup. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, knowing that within those pages lay my strength, my answer, my shield. I brewed tea slowly, the way Richard had taught me, boiling water first, then pouring it carefully over the leaves. As the steam rose, I thought of Robert's words. Timing is the sharpest weapon. Silence would be my ally. But silence without preparation was nothing but vulnerability. I needed to be ready. The next day, I walked into town and made copies of every paper Robert had confirmed. I watched as the machine light scanned across the pages, imprinting the truth again and again. Each copy felt like a layer of armor. I folded them neatly into separate envelopes and placed them in different places. One in my purse, one in the drawer of my nightstand, one tucked inside a cookbook Richard once loved. A quiet insurance policy. Angela noticed my errands. That evening she asked, "Where were you today?" Her tone was sharp but casual, as though she already suspected mischief. "I went to the market," I said, placing groceries on the counter. My voice was even, calm. The truth sat in my bag, hidden but heavy. She studied me for a moment, searching for cracks in my expression. When she found none, she moved on, instructing the caterer over the phone. I carried my tea into the garden, watching the sun dip below the roses Richard planted. The petals glowed faintly in the twilight. I whispered to them, "You grew because we cared for you, not because someone claimed you." The roses swayed gently, as if answering. At night, I laid the original documents beneath my pillow. I could feel their presence through the fabric, steadying my breath. It was not fear that kept me awake, but resolve. For the first time in days, I did not feel cornered. I felt prepared. Over the following week, Angela's plans grew louder. Trucks arrived, dropping off boxes of glassware and decorations. Strangers came and went, rearranging rooms, taking measurements, treating me as if I were invisible. David's silence deepened. He avoided my eyes, his words clipped. His loyalty tied more to Angela than to me. One afternoon, I overheard Angela on the phone. She was laughing with someone saying, "Once we have the mansion, everything else will fall into place. Margaret won't be a problem. She's too weak to stand in our way." Her words stung, but instead of breaking me, they reminded me of Robert's advice. "Wait, hold your silence. Let them reveal themselves." And so, I did. Each night, I wrote small notes to myself and tucked them into the drawer. Reminders that I was not powerless. Reminders that Richard had trusted me. Reminders that silence could be action, not absence. The notes became a ritual, a conversation with myself. I also began noticing Emily, Angela's younger sister, watching me from across the room. Her eyes were softer, uncertain, almost apologetic. She rarely spoke when Angela was near, but I sensed something in her. Perhaps she too carried doubts. Perhaps she saw me not as an obstacle, but as a person. Still, I said nothing. The mansion buzzed with activity, with plans that did not include me. Yet beneath that noise, I held my quiet, my documents, my cracked teacup. Angela thought I was fading. She didn't realize I was gathering. One evening, as I placed the copies into a new hiding spot beneath the floorboards of the study, I whispered to the house itself, "We are ready, Richard. When the moment comes, they will learn that silence is not surrender. It is strength sharpened in waiting." The following Saturday, Angela announced there would be a family-only dinner at the mansion. She said it casually, while ordering linens over the phone, as though it were the most natural thing. But when I asked what time I should be ready, she paused, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Oh, Margaret," she said with a laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "It's really just immediate family. You don't need to trouble yourself. You know how overwhelming these things can be." Immediate family. The words stung. I was David's mother. I was the one who gave birth to him, who raised him in this very house. If that didn't count as family, what did? That evening, I listened from the top of the staircase as the dining room filled with voices. The chandelier glowed, casting warm light across polished plates and crystal glasses. Laughter rolled through the air, clinking with forks and wine. I stayed hidden, though the ache in my chest grew heavier with every passing minute. At one point, I heard Angela's voice rise above the others. "This mansion is the perfect place for new beginnings," she said. "It feels like it was waiting for us all along." Her words were met with cheers, as if she had just announced a conquest. I leaned against the banister, gripping it until my fingers ached. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary drifted upward, a cruel reminder of the meals I once cooked in that same kitchen, the meals that once held this family together. Halfway through the dinner, I couldn't resist. I walked quietly into the hallway, just far enough to see them. David sat at the head of the table, Angela by his side, glowing in her element. He looked older than I remembered, older not with years, but with weariness. His eyes caught mine for just a moment before flicking away. Angela noticed. She turned, her smile sharp. "Margaret," she said sweetly, "you didn't need to come down. We didn't want you to feel pressured." Her guests chuckled softly, their glances brushing over me like I was some unwanted shadow. I forced a small smile. I just wanted to see how everything looked. My voice was calm, though inside, my heart raced. One of Angela's friends asked, "Does she live here full time?" The question was directed to Angela, not to me. Angela answered without hesitation. "For now, yes, but it's been hard. Sometimes she gets overwhelmed, emotionally unstable, you might say. We're trying to make things easier for her." The words dropped like stones into the room. My son didn't speak. He didn't object. He didn't even flinch. He simply lowered his gaze, letting the lie settle like truth. I felt the blood rush to my ears. Emotionally unstable. That was what they called the years of sacrifice, the decades of holding everything together. I steadied myself by wrapping both hands around my cracked teacup, which I had carried down with me like armor. I lifted it slowly, taking a sip, refusing to let my hand shake. "Good night," I said softly, turning before anyone could see the tears brimming in my eyes. I climbed the staircase, each step heavier than the last, but my back straightened with every rise. I would not collapse before them. In my room, I sat by the window, staring out into the dark garden. Their laughter floated upward, muffled but relentless. I let the silence wrap around me like a cloak. Angela thought she had humiliated me. David thought he had chosen peace by choosing silence. But I knew the truth. Silence can wound too. And tonight, their silence had carved a scar that would not fade. I whispered to the empty room, to Richard, to myself. I am not unstable. I am steady. I am still here. After the family dinner, I didn't go back downstairs. I knew Angela and her friends would linger long into the night, drinking wine and congratulating each other on the life they believed was theirs already. Instead, I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and carried my cracked teacup out onto the porch. The night air was cool, crisp with the scent of roses and damp soil. I sat in the chair Richard had built for me, its wood worn smooth by years of use. From here, I could see the oak tree with the old swing, swaying faintly in the breeze. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the open windows. But out here, the silence was stronger. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth steady my hands. Inside, they called me unstable. Out here, under the stars, I felt steadier than ever. Silence wrapped around me like a second skin. It did not shame me. It protected me. I thought of David. My son. My boy who once ran barefoot through this garden, chasing fireflies with a jar in his hands. I could almost hear his giggles floating in the night air, mixing with the distant echoes of his voice now. Older, quieter, complicit. It hurt to admit that the child I raised had chosen not to defend me, but I refused to let that hurt break me. Instead, I held it like a stone in my pocket. Heavy, yes, but grounding. Angela's words replayed in my mind. Disappear. Stay out of sight. To her, silence meant erasure, but I knew better. Silence could also be defiance. By sitting here, by refusing to vanish, I was already resisting. The cracked teacup gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Its imperfection had become my mirror. People could call it fragile, useless, yet it still held tea. It still served its purpose. Like me, it was flawed, but unbroken. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes. The creak of the porch boards beneath me sounded like Richard's voice whispering, steady and sure. Life is a battle, Maggie, but you fight it with steadiness, not with noise. The more I sat in silence, the stronger I felt. My breathing slowed. My heartbeat steadied. The noise inside the mansion grew distant, like a storm that could not touch me. Out here, I was in control. My silence was not their victory. It was mine. When the guests finally left, I heard their cars roll down the gravel driveway. Angela's laughter faded, replaced by the chirp of crickets. The mansion fell quiet. For the first time in weeks, the house seemed to exhale, as if relieved to rest. I whispered to the night, to Richard, to myself. They think I am gone, but I am still here. As I rose to return inside, I touched the wooden railing, feeling its roughness beneath my fingers. This house had weathered storms before. It had endured rain, wind, fire in the hearth, and the weight of time. It would endure this too. I carried the empty teacup back to the kitchen, washed it gently, and placed it on the counter. I looked at it one last time before turning off the light. My silence tonight had been more powerful than any words I could have spoken. Angela might call it weakness. David might see it as passivity. But I knew the truth. Silence was my strength. It was the pause before the strike, the calm before the reveal. It was not surrender. It was preparation. And as I climbed the stairs to bed, I felt steadier than I had in a long time. The battle was not over. In many ways, it had only just begun. The next morning, the mansion was unusually quiet. Angela had gone into town to meet with the florist, and David left early for work. I poured myself tea, the cracked cup warming my palms, when I heard a gentle knock on the kitchen door. When I opened it, I found Emily, Angela's younger sister, standing shyly on the porch. She was carrying a small basket of muffins wrapped in cloth. Her eyes, unlike Angela's, did not pierce. They softened when they met mine. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," she said quietly. I thought you might like these." I invited her in, surprised. We sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the window. She glanced around the room as if she knew its stories, but with respect, not hunger. "I know my sister can be strong," she said carefully, searching for the right word. "Sometimes too strong. I wanted to check on you." Her words startled me. No one had asked how I was doing. Not David, not Angela, not anyone. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. I smiled faintly, wrapping my hands tighter around the teacup. "I'm managing. This house and we've learned to be steady." Emily studied the cup in my hands, her gaze lingering on the crack. "That cup," she said softly. "It looks like it's been through a lot, but it's still here." Her observation made my throat tighten. I realized she saw more than she let on. As we ate the muffins, she began to open up. "Angela doesn't mean to be cruel," she said, though her tone betrayed doubt. She always thinks she knows best. She's been like that since we were children, always deciding for everyone else." I listened quietly, letting Emily speak. Her voice trembled slightly, but her honesty shone through. For the first time, I saw a reflection of myself in someone within Angela's family. A younger woman, caught in the shadow of someone louder, someone who demanded the spotlight. "I'm sorry for what she said to you," Emily continued, her eyes meeting mine. "I heard, the night she told you to disappear. I was in the hallway." She swallowed hard. "I thought about saying something, but I didn't, and I regret that." I placed my hand gently on hers. "Silence can be painful," I said softly. "But silence can also be strength. Sometimes we wait, sometimes we endure, and sometimes we speak only when the moment is right." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be like her," she whispered. "You don't have to be," I answered. "We all choose who we become." The house seemed to listen too. The sunlight shifted across the walls, casting a golden glow on Emily's face. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Not every voice around me sought to erase me. At least one voice understood. Before she left, Emily turned at the door. "If you ever need someone to really see you, I'll be here." I nodded, clutching my cup close. "Thank you, Emily. That means more than you know." When the door closed behind her, I sat in the quiet kitchen, the basket of muffins still on the table. I thought about how sometimes the smallest gestures hold the most weight. Emily's kindness was not loud, but it was steady. It reminded me that not all battles are fought with noise. Some are won with quiet compassion. As I carried the muffins to the counter, I whispered to myself, "Even shadows can reflect light." And for the first time in many days, I allowed myself to smile. That evening, the house felt different, not because the walls had changed or the floors had stopped creaking, but because of what Emily had left behind with her presence. A ripple of kindness, quiet but real, still lingered in the air. I walked into the study, the room where Richard once spent hours with his books, and where I often hid after Angela's sharp words. On the shelf, my eyes landed on the row of teacups I had collected over the years. Among them was the cracked one I used that morning, its fracture a thin line running down the porcelain like a scar. I lifted it gently and carried it back to the kitchen. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock. I thought about Emily's words. That cup looks like it's been through a lot, but it's still here. The truth was, so was I. The next afternoon, Emily returned. This time, she knocked softly and stepped inside without waiting for Angela's permission. I found her in the kitchen, her hands resting on the counter like she belonged. There was something timid but determined in her presence. "I don't know why I came back so soon," she admitted. "But I felt like you had more to say yesterday, and maybe I needed to listen." I poured us both tea, the steam rising slowly between us. As I set the cracked cup before her, she hesitated. "Oh," she whispered, almost embarrassed. "You remembered what I said." I nodded. "This cup has been with me for decades. Richard bought it at a flea market when we couldn't afford much. He told me that sometimes the things with imperfections carry the most history." Her fingers brushed the edge of the cup, as though she was afraid of breaking it further. Why give it to me? She asked. Because you saw it, I replied simply. Not everyone notices what has endured. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the weight of silence heavier than any conversation. And yet, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of recognition, of shared truths, of something fragile but genuine. I found myself telling her pieces of my past, how Richard and I had saved every penny to build this house, how I had planted roses in the garden so my son would grow up knowing beauty, how every corner of this mansion carried a memory that Angela dismissed as outdated clutter. Emily listened without interruption, her eyes never wandering. At one point, she wiped a tear quickly, as though ashamed of her emotion. You've given so much, she said softly, and they treat you as if you're invisible. That's not fair. Fair. The word rang in my ears. Life rarely was. But hearing it from her, hearing someone acknowledge it, felt like a balm. I placed my hand over hers again, just as I had the day before. Emily, you are not your sister. Don't carry her shadow on your shoulders. You have your own light. Her lips trembled into a smile. I hope so. Before she left, I pressed the cracked cup into her hands. She looked startled. I can't take this, she protested. Yes, you can, I insisted. It's not just a cup. It's a reminder that even with cracks, we hold. She clutched it carefully, as though it were treasure. I'll keep it safe, she promised. When the door closed behind her, I stood in the stillness of the kitchen. Something inside me shifted. For so long, I had felt alone in this battle, erased by voices louder than mine. But now, in Emily, I saw possibility, a witness, a quiet ally. I whispered to myself, even if the world forgets me, not everyone will. And for the first time, the silence of the mansion did not feel like erasure. It felt like strength, waiting to be spoken at the right moment. It didn't take long for Angela to notice the shift. She had an eye for control, and anything outside her orbit unsettled her. Emily's visits, though quiet and brief, had not escaped her scrutiny. One afternoon, I was sitting in the garden, trimming the roses, when Angela appeared in the doorway. Her heels clicked sharply against the stone, each step punctuating her irritation. You've been seeing a lot of Emily, she said, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her tone carried no curiosity, only accusation. I looked up, letting the shears rest in my lap. She brings muffins sometimes. And company. Angela's eyes narrowed. She doesn't know you like I do. She gets carried away. You shouldn't encourage her. She can be naive. Naive. The word cut sharper than she intended, not because it described Emily, but because it revealed how Angela saw everyone around her. Tools or fools. I resisted the urge to defend Emily outright. Instead, I let silence answer. Angela stepped closer, her shadow falling over me. Emily's young, impressionable. She doesn't understand the pressures of a wedding, of a family legacy. I won't have her confused by your stories. I met her gaze steadily. They aren't stories. They're memories. This house carries them in every corner. She forced a laugh, brittle and cold. Memories don't pay bills, Margaret. Memories don't move life forward. That's why David and I are here, to bring this house into the future. Her words stung, but I remained still. The future, I said softly, doesn't erase the past. It builds on it. For a moment, her eyes flickered with something, perhaps frustration, perhaps fear. Then she straightened, her mask snapping back into place. Emily will be too busy to visit you anymore. I'll make sure of it. She turned sharply and walked away, her perfume lingering in the air like smoke. That night, I sat by the window with my cracked teacup, the roses glowing faintly in the moonlight. I thought about Angela's warning. She could try to sever Emily from me, but she could not erase what had already been exchanged. The recognition, the shared silences, the passing of the cup. The next day, Emily appeared again, her eyes brighter but her steps more hesitant. She closed the door behind her quickly, as though afraid of being caught. "Angela told me not to come," she admitted, "but I couldn't stay away." I poured tea, this time into a plain cup, and set it before her. "I don't want you to feel trapped between us," I said gently. Emily shook her head. "It's not about choosing sides. It's about what feels right. When I'm here, I feel seen. With her, I feel like I'm always performing." Her words echoed my own heart. I told her quietly, "You don't need to perform here." She smiled, small but genuine. And in that moment, I realized Angela's suspicion was not misplaced. Emily and I had formed a bond that Angela could neither control nor predict. It frightened her because it reminded her that not everyone bowed to her command. When Emily left that afternoon, I watched her walk down the driveway, the cracked cup cradled carefully in her hands. I whispered to myself, even the smallest fracture can spread light. Inside the house, Angela's footsteps echoed upstairs, pacing like a storm brewing. I knew she would not let this go. Her control was slipping, and when people like Angela felt it slip, they tightened their grip with claws. But I wasn't afraid, because for the first time, I wasn't standing alone. The storm came sooner than I expected. It was Sunday evening, and David had insisted we all sit down together for dinner. I suspected he hoped to smooth tensions, though his silence in recent weeks had made him more shadow than peacemaker. Still, I agreed, because sometimes storms must be faced head-on. Angela entered the dining room in a silk dress the color of wine, her eyes sharp and glittering with resolve. Emily trailed behind her, hesitant, clutching the cracked cup I had given her as if it were the only shield she possessed. The table was set with crystal and candles, the kind of arrangement Angela adored. I sat across from David, with Emily beside me. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves braced for impact. Dinner began with small talk, strained and fragile. Angela asked David about work. He answered in clipped sentences. She described floral arrangements. No one replied. The silence between words grew louder than the words themselves. Finally, Angela placed her fork down, the silver striking porcelain like a gavel. "We need to clear the air," she declared. Her gaze swept from me to Emily, sharp as glass. "There's been too much confusion lately, and it's time to set boundaries." David shifted uncomfortably. Emily's shoulders tightened. I remained still, hands folded in my lap. Angela turned her eyes on Emily. "You've been spending too much time here. Margaret fills your head with stories, and you don't see how it's affecting you. This is not your battle. You need to decide where your loyalty lies, with your family or with her." Emily's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching. I didn't speak, didn't intervene. Silence can be heavier than any defense, and I wanted her to feel her own strength. Angela pressed on. "You're my sister, Emily. You should be supporting me, not undermining me. This wedding is about building a future, not clinging to the past. Margaret doesn't understand that. She wants to hold on to a crumbling house, to a memory that no longer serves anyone." The words struck me, but I let them wash over me. My steadiness unsettled her more than protest ever could. David finally cleared his throat. "Angela," he began. But Angela cut him off. "No, David. This is important. Margaret has made Emily her confidant, and that's dangerous. It divides us. We need to stand united." Emily's fingers tightened around the cracked cup. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she drew in a slow breath. "Maybe Margaret isn't dividing us," she whispered. "Maybe she's the only one holding something real together." The room fell silent. Even the candles seemed to flicker more faintly. Angela's face hardened, her cheeks flushed with fury. "You don't know what you're saying," Angela snapped. "She's manipulating you. She's weak, and she wants you to be weak too." I placed my hands flat on the table, my voice calm but steady. "Weakness is not what you see, Angela. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest truths." Emily looked at me, then back at her sister. For the first time, her back straightened. "I'm not choosing sides," she said firmly, "but I won't abandon Margaret, not when she's shown me more honesty than you ever have." Angela's eyes widened, shock flickering across her face. For once, her control slipped. David sat frozen, torn between the two women, his silence louder than his words. I lifted my teacup and took a sip, letting the moment settle. The power in the room had shifted, not with shouting, but with quiet resolve. Angela felt it too. I could see it in the way her jaw clenched, in the way her hand trembled as she lifted her glass. The storm had broken, and though I did not raise my voice, I knew. A new chapter had begun. The days after that dinner felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Angela no longer bothered with subtlety. She moved through the mansion as if it were already hers, her heels tapping sharply across the wood floors, her commands echoing like orders in a house that had once been filled with laughter. One morning, I noticed something peculiar. Drawers in the study had been left open. Papers were scattered on the desk that I knew I had carefully organized the night before. At first, I thought I had been careless, but the truth pressed itself on me quickly. Angela was searching. I kept silent, observing from the edges. She began lingering near my room, glancing inside whenever she passed. Once, I caught her holding one of Richard's old ledgers, flipping through it with impatient hands. She wasn't looking for memories. She was hunting for leverage. I knew what she wanted. Proof. Proof that the mansion was vulnerable, that she could claim it without me standing in her way. But she didn't know about Robert's clause, written into the deed like a quiet shield. And she certainly didn't know about the copies I had hidden away in different corners of this house. That evening, I watched from the top of the staircase as Angela entered the study again. The door creaked open, and she slipped inside, unaware that I could see her. She rifled through drawers, scattering receipts, photographs, letters. At one point, she even pulled open the cabinet where Richard once stored his cigars, tossing the empty boxes aside. Her frustration grew. I could hear it in the way she slammed drawers shut, in the hiss of her breath. Finally, she found a locked drawer in the desk, the one where I had once kept Richard's letters. She pulled at it, cursed under her breath, then left the room, her face red with irritation. Later, when I entered the study, I restored everything quietly. I placed my hand on the locked drawer, whispering to Richard, "She doesn't know where the truth lives." Then I opened the small floorboard where one copy of the deed rested, checking to be sure it was still there. The paper lay undisturbed, my hidden safeguard against her greed. Angela's suspicion only deepened. She began questioning David more directly, asking if he knew what papers I carried, what arrangements Richard might have left. David's answers were vague, uncertain. I could see the discomfort in his eyes, but he didn't defend me. He never did. One afternoon, I overheard Angela speaking on the phone in the hallway. Her voice was low, urgent. "There has to be a way," she said. "Find out if the deed lists her as the sole decision-maker. There must be some loophole." She listened, then snapped, "No, I don't care how much it costs. I need this done before the wedding." I returned to my room and sat with my cracked teacup. Angela's desperation was clear now. She wasn't just planning a wedding. She was planning a takeover. And she was running out of time. Yet, I did not feel fear. I felt steadiness. Because no matter how hard she searched, no matter how many drawers she opened, she would never find the papers she wanted. She was digging through shadows, while the truth rested in places she could not touch. I whispered to myself, "Let her dig. The deeper she claws, the clearer her intentions will be to everyone else." The house creaked softly in agreement, as though it too understood. Angela thought she was uncovering secrets. What she didn't realize was that she was revealing her own. Within a week, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted again. I could feel it in the way Angela carried herself, sharper, more restless. She had begun making phone calls in the evenings, pacing the halls with her voice lowered but insistent. I did not need to hear every word to know what she was doing. Angela had hired a lawyer. I saw the change in her eyes. Calculated, predatory. She was no longer satisfied with flowers and table settings. Now she wanted contracts, documents, signatures. She was hunting for a weakness in the wall Richard had built around me. One night, as I came down for a glass of water, I caught a fragment of her voice on the phone. "Find a way to contest it," she whispered fiercely. "There must be something. I don't care how long it takes. Margaret can't keep this house forever." I slipped back upstairs without being seen, my heart steady, not panicked. Because while Angela searched for loopholes, I knew Robert Sterling had left none. Still, the fact that she was bringing outsiders into this war unsettled me. She wasn't just playing games anymore. She was laying siege. David, meanwhile, grew quieter. He avoided my eyes at breakfast, kept his conversations shallow. But silence has its own language, and I could read the unease in his face. One morning, he lingered at the kitchen door as I poured tea. "Mom," he said softly, "Angela, she's under a lot of pressure. You know how weddings are. Maybe if you just..." "Just what?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "Maybe if you signed something small, temporary, to give her peace of mind." I set the teacup down slowly, deliberately, and looked at him. "David, peace of mind doesn't come from erasing someone. And your wife doesn't want peace. She wants power." He flinched at my words, but said nothing more. When he left the room, I felt the ache of a son torn between blood and marriage. Yet I also knew that wavering in silence was still a choice. Emily noticed the tension too. She came by one afternoon, her hands clasped tightly, the cracked cup still tucked carefully in her bag. "Angela's been making calls," she admitted nervously. "She told me if I keep visiting you, I'll regret it. She said I'll end up cut out of her life." I sighed, touching her shoulder. "That's not a threat, Emily. That's a confession. She's afraid of what you see when you're here." Emily's eyes shone with tears. "I don't want to be caught in the middle." "You already are," I said gently. But remember this: truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to endure. That night, I sat by the fire with the original documents in my lap. I traced Richard's signature with my fingertip, remembering the way his hand had held mine as he signed them years ago. His foresight was my shield now. But foresight alone wasn't enough. Timing mattered. Robert had been right. I folded the papers carefully and tucked them back into their envelope. Then I whispered aloud, as if speaking to Richard himself. Not yet, but soon. The mansion groaned softly in the night, the woods settling like an old friend leaning closer. I felt its strength around me, as though it too was waiting. Angela thought her lawyer would uncover an opening. David thought silence would keep the peace. Emily thought she might lose her sister's love. But I knew the truth. A tide was rising, and when it broke, only those who stood steady would remain unshaken. And I had been steady for a long time. After days of listening to Angela's footsteps pacing the halls, of watching David drown himself in silence, I knew it was time to act. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with the steady precision Richard had entrusted to me. I called Robert Sterling one crisp morning, my voice low, as though the very walls might betray me. He answered on the second ring, his tone calm, steady, the same as it had been the day he first explained Richard's clause. "Robert," I said, "it's time." He didn't ask what I meant. He simply replied, "Come by tomorrow. Bring the originals. We'll prepare what needs to be prepared." That night, I sat at my desk, spreading the documents across the wood surface. The deed, the clause, Richard's careful handwriting. I read every line, committing each word to memory. It wasn't just paper. It was Richard's voice, echoing through time, ensuring I would not be erased. I thought about Angela's lawyer, about her frantic whispers down the phone line. She was searching for a way in, but she had forgotten that some doors don't open with force. They open only with keys forged years earlier, in love and foresight. Richard had given me that key. The next morning, I dressed in my plain navy coat and slipped the envelope into my bag. The house watched me leave, the front door groaning softly, as if acknowledging the journey I was taking. Robert's office smelled of old books and ink. He greeted me with a firm handshake and guided me into the quiet of his study. I handed him the documents, my fingers reluctant to let go. He studied them carefully, nodding. "We'll make certified copies," he explained, "and I'll file a notice with the county clerk. This way, even if Angela's lawyer digs, he'll find a wall he cannot climb." I exhaled, relief flooding me. But Robert wasn't finished. "Margaret," he said gently, "you have more power than you realize. These papers give you control. But the way you use that control, that's what will define the ending." His words stayed with me as I walked home. I passed the bookstore downstairs, the same one I had lingered in weeks ago. A novel in the window caught my eye, its cover showing a woman standing on a cliff, the sea crashing below her, her back turned but her stance unbroken. I felt a kinship with that image. At home, the mansion was alive with preparations. Strangers carried boxes through the halls. Decorators argued over fabric swatches. Angela issued instructions with the authority of someone who believed she already owned it all. She barely glanced at me as I walked by, her attention fixed on her imagined kingdom. But Emily noticed. She slipped into the hallway and whispered, "Are you all right?" I smiled faintly, touching her arm. "I'm better than all right." That night, I wrote another note to myself and placed it in the drawer. Power is not in the noise. Power is in the moment you choose to reveal what has always been yours. I drank tea slowly by the window, the moonlight falling across the roses Richard had planted. For the first time since Angela uttered the word disappear, I felt something stronger than sorrow. I felt anticipation. The quiet move had begun. The closer the wedding drew, the faster Angela's footsteps became. She barked orders to decorators, berated the florist, and summoned delivery trucks until the driveway looked more like a marketplace than a home. The mansion groaned under the weight of her vision, as though it too was being forced into clothes that didn't fit. David moved through it all like a shadow, nodding when asked, silent when challenged. I watched him carry boxes of champagne inside, his shoulders bent, his face pale. He rarely looked at me now. Perhaps guilt had sealed his lips, or perhaps loyalty to Angela outweighed blood. Either way, the son I once knew seemed more absent with every passing day. Angela's lawyer began visiting, his car a sleek black shape in the driveway. I saw them together in the parlor, bent over papers, her voice low but firm. Once, as I passed by, I caught her words. She won't see it coming. By the time she realizes, it will be too late. But I knew better. I had already seen everything coming. Emily continued to slip through the cracks Angela tried to close. She came in the evenings, when the house was quieter, bringing small comforts, a jar of honey, a scarf she had knitted, her quiet presence. She never stayed long, but long enough for me to feel less alone. The cracked cup was always with her, cradled in her hands like a fragile promise. "You look calmer than anyone else in this house," she said one night, sitting beside me on the porch. "Calm doesn't mean blind," I answered softly. "It means ready." She tilted her head, studying me. "Angela thinks she's tightening her grip, but I think she's losing it." Her words echoed my own thoughts. Angela was building her kingdom on noise, but noise can't hide the cracks in its foundation. The more frantic her pace, the clearer it became that she feared time was not on her side. The wedding planner arrived the next day, flustered, apologizing that Angela had changed the color scheme again. I overheard her say, "It has to be perfect. This house has to shine as ours." Ours. The word rang in my ears. Not mine, not David's, but theirs, as if I had already been written out. That evening, I walked the halls alone, touching the walls with my fingertips. I whispered to them the way I once whispered to Richard. "Hold steady," I told the house. "Just a little longer." I stopped in the study and lifted the floorboard where one set of copies rested. I checked them carefully, then returned them to their hiding place. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink, but to me it smelled like armor. When I returned upstairs, I heard Angela on the phone again, her voice sharp. "We'll push the transfer right after the ceremony. She won't resist in front of guests. She'll be too humiliated." Her arrogance almost made me laugh. She thought silence was humiliation. She didn't understand that silence could also be preparation. Later that night, I lit a single candle in my room and wrote another note to myself. They believe they are winning. Let them. The louder they cheer, the harder the silence will strike when the truth is revealed. I folded the note and slipped it into the drawer, alongside the others. My secret record, my quiet testimony. The house sighed around me as I blew out the candle. Angela thought she was building momentum, that her power grew with every plan, every visitor, every whispered scheme. But I knew the truth. Power built on noise crumbles. Power built on silence endures. And so, I waited. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived draped in glitter and noise. The mansion glowed with lanterns strung across the garden, their light bouncing off polished glassware and silk tablecloths. Guests filled the air with chatter, their laughter ringing like bells in a house that once held quieter, truer joys. I sat at the edge of it all, near the roses Richard and I had planted decades earlier. My chair was tucked slightly out of view, as if by design. From here, I could see everything. The way Angela held court at the center of the table. The way David leaned toward her as though tethered. The way Emily shifted uneasily, her eyes finding mine across the crowd. The clinking of silverware called for silence, and Angela rose with a glass in hand. She smiled, her voice carrying the easy authority of someone who believed the world belonged to her. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began. "This house has given us the perfect stage for our new beginning. It's not just a building. It's a symbol of where we're going, of the future we're building together." Applause rippled through the tables. I lifted my teacup, the plain one I used when guests filled the house, and took a quiet sip. Angela's eyes slid toward me, her smile sharpening. "Of course," she said, "we couldn't have done it without Margaret. She's been patient with us, even when things might have been overwhelming for her." Soft laughter rose among the guests. My heart clenched, but I kept my face steady. "She's had a lot on her plate," Angela continued, "and sometimes it hasn't been easy for her to keep up. But tonight, let's raise a glass to her, for letting go, for giving us this gift." The words struck like stones, yet I did not flinch. Around me, guests lifted their glasses. David's eyes flickered toward me for a fraction of a second, then dropped again. Emily looked horrified, her glass trembling in her hand. I placed my cup gently on the table, my fingers calm. I did not rise, did not protest. Silence held me like armor. Angela mistook it for surrender. "See?" She laughed lightly, her voice carrying. "She agrees. Margaret knows it's time to pass the torch." More laughter, more clinking glasses. My chest ached, but I drew in a deep breath. This was her stage tonight, her moment of triumph. Let her have it. Because I knew something she did not. I knew the papers Robert had filed were already sealed, the law already on my side. I knew that no amount of laughter or humiliation could strip me of the truth Richard had left me. I looked at Emily again. Her eyes glistened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked ready to speak, ready to defend me. But I shook my head ever so slightly. Not yet. Timing is the sharpest weapon. The evening dragged on, filled with speeches, toasts, and the hollow sound of Angela's victory. I endured it all in silence, sipping tea, letting my stillness unsettle those who dared to look closely. Because silence is not weakness. It is a waiting room for justice. When the dinner finally ended and the guests drifted away, I lingered by the roses. Emily found me there, her voice trembling. "How could you sit through that?" I touched one of the blossoms, its petals soft against my fingers. "Because storms always spend themselves, Emily. And when they do, what's steady remains." She looked at me, her cracked cup clutched tightly in her hands. In her eyes, I saw not pity, but recognition. She understood. As I turned back toward the glowing house, I whispered to Richard, to myself, to the night, "Let her laugh. Tomorrow, she will learn what silence has been holding." The house was unusually still after the rehearsal dinner. The laughter had faded, the clinking glasses silenced, but their echoes lingered in the walls like stains that couldn't be scrubbed away. I walked through the dim halls alone, my hand brushing the railing of the staircase, my heart heavy yet steady. Upstairs, in my room, I lit a single candle. The soft glow flickered against the window, illuminating the papers spread across my desk. I ran my fingers over Richard's handwriting, the familiar curves of his signature. It was as if he were still here, guiding me, whispering the wisdom he had always carried. I sat down with the cracked teacup beside me, full of warm chamomile. Its fracture caught the candlelight, glowing like a scar turned into something sacred. That cup had been with me through humiliation, silence, and small moments of kindness. Tomorrow, it would sit with me again when everything shifted. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting memories rise like tide water. I saw Richard in the garden, his hands deep in the soil as he planted the first rosebush. I heard his laughter in the kitchen, saw him leaning against the counter, with flour on his shirt, after baking bread. I remembered the night he handed me this very deed, his voice quiet but certain. If ever they forget who you are, this paper will remind them. My throat tightened. For years, I had believed my worth was measured in how much I gave, how much I sacrificed for David, how much I surrendered to keep the peace. I thought silence was erasure. But now, I understood silence differently. It was not absence. It was preservation. It was choosing the right moment to speak so that your words land like stone on still water. Tomorrow, Angela believed she would triumph. She thought the mansion would be hers, that her laughter would drown me out, that her lawyer's words would seal my silence. But tomorrow, she would discover what Richard left me, and more importantly, what I had become. I whispered into the quiet, speaking as if Richard sat across from me. I used to think I was weak, that enduring meant disappearing, but you knew better. You left me strength in ink and law. You left me a voice that doesn't need to shout. I turned to the drawer, filled with the notes I had written to myself over the weeks. I pulled them out, one by one, reading them aloud in the candlelight. Silence can be strength. Power is in timing. Truth endures. Each line was a thread, weaving together the woman I had become. I tucked the notes back into the drawer, feeling lighter. Tomorrow, I would no longer need them. Tomorrow, the house itself would speak for me. Before climbing into bed, I walked to the window. The garden stretched below, the roses glowing faintly under the moonlight. I thought of David as a child, running barefoot through the grass. I thought of the man he had become, silent, distant, bound by fear and love tangled in the wrong places. My heart ached for him, but I also knew this. Sometimes love means letting someone face the truth without your protection. I whispered one last thought into the night. Tomorrow, Richard, they will try to erase me, but tomorrow I will stand. Not loud, not cruel, simply steady. The candle flickered once, then steadied. I climbed into bed, the deed tucked beneath my pillow, the cracked cup resting on the nightstand. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried me like a tide, pulling me toward the dawn that would change everything. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the sky itself had dressed in celebration. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, warming the polished floors of the mansion. Outside, the driveway filled with cars, one after another, until the gravel crunched endlessly beneath tires. Guests in elegant suits and dresses floated across the lawn. their voices carrying like a tide, rising against the house. I sat at the kitchen table with my cracked teacup, sipping slowly, the steam curling against my face. While the world around me rushed, I remained still. Calm was my armor. Silence was my language. Through the window, I could see Angela directing everything. Her gown shimmered like spun glass, her voice sharp as she barked at the florist about the placement of roses, at the caterer about the champagne. Her smile never wavered when guests approached, but the edges of it were brittle, cracking under the weight of her own expectations. David trailed behind her, his tuxedo hanging loosely on his frame. His eyes darted toward me once as he crossed the garden, but quickly shifted away, as if he couldn't bear the reflection he might find in mine. Emily slipped inside quietly, her hands wrapped protectively around the cracked cup I had given her. She stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment, then whispered, "You're so calm." I smiled faintly. Calm doesn't mean unprepared. Her eyes shone with something between fear and admiration. They think today is theirs. They can think what they like, I answered. Truth doesn't need an audience. It only needs a moment. The house hummed with footsteps, laughter, and the rustle of silk. Yet beneath it all, I felt the steadiness of the walls, as though the mansion itself knew what was coming. This was not Angela's house, not David's, not even mine alone. It was Richard's legacy, and it had chosen its keeper. As the ceremony hour approached, the guests gathered in the grand hall, where sunlight poured through tall windows onto rows of white chairs. Musicians tuned their instruments, the sound of strings filling the air with nervous beauty. I stood at the edge, unnoticed by most, my presence an afterthought. Angela floated down the stairs, radiant in her gown, her arm looped through David's. Gasps of admiration filled the room. She looked triumphant, as though every petal, every ribbon, every shimmer of light belonged to her. When she reached the bottom step, her eyes found me. For a brief moment, her smile sharpened. She leaned toward me as she passed and whispered so softly no one else could hear, "This is the last time you'll sit in this house as if it's yours." I did not answer. I simply lifted my cup and sipped my tea, the silence between us louder than any words. Guests took their seats. The officiant cleared his throat, and the ceremony began. Vows were spoken, music swelled, and applause thundered as Angela and David stood together, bathed in light. They believed they had sealed their future, but I knew the truth waited, patient, in the folds of paper resting safely in my bag. As the guests filed into the reception, chatter filling the air like birdsong, I remained near the edge, steady, unseen yet unshaken. My moment had not yet come. Timing, Robert had said, is the sharpest weapon. And the time was drawing near. I whispered to myself, my voice swallowed by the music and laughter around me. Let them celebrate. The house knows who it belongs to. Soon they will too. The reception was a glittering blur of voices, music, and glasses lifted high. The chandeliers glowed above the hall, scattering light across silk dresses and polished shoes. Guests danced, laughed, and congratulated Angela and David as though they had already stepped into the life they imagined, the mansion as their crown, the future as their stage. I sat quietly at the far end of the hall, my cracked teacup steady in my hands. Each sip was deliberate, each silence a stone dropped into the rushing river of noise. Angela soon called for attention. She rose in the center of the room, her gown shimmering under the lights, her arm looped tightly through David's. She looked every bit the queen of her imagined kingdom. "Everyone," she said, her voice ringing with triumph. "Tonight we celebrate not just our wedding, but a new beginning in this house. This mansion, this legacy, now belongs to us. It will be the heart of our family for generations to come." The guests erupted in applause, their cheers echoing off the high ceilings. Glasses clinked, voices rose, and Angela basked in their admiration. She turned her gaze toward me, her smile sharp, expecting my silence to confirm her claim. But tonight, my silence was ready to shift. I rose slowly, setting the teacup carefully on the table. The room seemed to notice, the applause faltering just slightly as eyes turned toward me. I walked forward, each step steady, my presence quiet but unyielding. When I reached the center, I lifted the envelope from my bag. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of paper and truth carried its own volume. "These are the documents Richard signed before he passed," I said evenly, my words carrying in the sudden hush. "The deed, the clause, the law. This house cannot be transferred, sold, or celebrated without my consent, and my consent has not been given." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint rustle of silk and the clink of a glass set too quickly on a table. Angela's face drained of color, then flushed with anger. "You're lying," she snapped, her voice sharp but trembling. "This is our wedding. This house." Robert Sterling, who had quietly slipped into the reception at my invitation, stepped forward. His presence was calm, authoritative. "I can confirm," he said, holding up the certified copies. "The deed is binding. Margaret Hayes is the sole authority over this property." A ripple of shock moved through the guests. Some whispered. Some stared at Angela with wide eyes. David's face collapsed into something pale and broken, his lips parting without words. I didn't look at them. I simply turned back to my teacup, lifting it once more, my hands steady. "I was told to disappear," I said softly, though the room heard every word. Instead, I remained, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in truth. Angela's mouth opened, but no sound came. The silence of the room weighed heavier than any outburst. Emily stepped closer, clutching the cracked cup I had given her. Her eyes met mine, filled with quiet strength. For the first time, she spoke into the silence. "She's not weak. She's the only reason this house still stands." The guests shifted, their applause gone, replaced by uneasy murmurs. Angela looked around, desperate for someone to rescue her, but none did. The stage she had built for herself crumbled in that quiet moment. I sipped from my cup once more, the tea warm against my lips. Power had not come from shouting, from threats, from spectacle. It had come from silence, from waiting, from revealing truth at the moment it mattered most. The mansion, my roses, Richard's memory, all of it remained mine. Not because I clung to it, but because I had endured long enough to let the truth speak for itself. The reception ended not with music or laughter, but with silence. The chandeliers still glowed, but their light felt cold, reflecting off half-finished glasses of champagne left scattered across the tables. Guests drifted toward the doors, their conversations hushed, their eyes glancing back at me, at Angela, at the wreckage of a night that had not gone as planned. Angela sat rigid in her chair, her face pale, her lips trembling as though words had abandoned her. The gown that had sparkled hours earlier now seemed too heavy for her shoulders. She clutched David's arm, but he pulled gently away. his eyes on the floor. Emily lingered by the roses at the edge of the hall, the cracked cup still in her hands. She looked at me, her expression steady, as though she understood this night was no victory march. It was survival, revelation, consequence. When the last guests left, the hall fell into stillness. Only the soft hum of the lights remained. Angela rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and turned on me. "You've humiliated us," she hissed, her voice shaking. "In front of everyone. How dare you?" I lifted my teacup once more, sipping slowly before answering. Truth does not humiliate Angela. Lies do. Her face flushed crimson. "This was supposed to be our future. You've ruined everything." "No," I said quietly, meeting her eyes. "I protected what was already mine." David finally spoke then, his voice low, strained. "Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why did you wait until now?" I looked at him, my heart tightening. "Because, David, you never asked. You never looked beyond her voice to hear mine. Silence was easier for you than choosing to see me." His face twisted with something between shame and grief. He stepped back, unable to hold my gaze. Angela let out a sharp laugh, brittle and hollow. "You think this is over? You think a piece of paper makes you stronger than me?" I set my cup down gently. Strength doesn't come from paper. It comes from enduring, from refusing to disappear, even when told to. Her eyes blazed, but she said nothing more. She stormed out of the hall, her footsteps echoing angrily up the staircase. The silence she left behind was heavier than her fury. David lingered a moment longer, his hands trembling at his sides. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Then don't say anything," I answered softly. "Just think about what silence has cost us both." He turned away, following Angela upstairs. I watched him go, my chest aching but steady. Some lessons could not be spoken into someone's heart. They had to feel the weight themselves. Emily approached quietly, setting the cracked cup beside mine on the table. "You didn't shout," she said softly. "You didn't even raise your voice. And still, you won." I shook my head gently. It wasn't about winning. It was about remembering who I am. She reached for my hand, squeezing it lightly. "I'll remember too." The house exhaled as the lights dimmed, as though it too was relieved the truth had finally been spoken aloud. For years, it had carried my silence within its walls. Tonight, that silence had found its moment. I gathered the documents back into their envelope and tucked them, safely, away. The hall, though emptied of laughter, no longer felt like a stage stolen from me. It felt like mine again. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I whispered to the roses in the garden below, "The storm has passed. What remains is what was always meant to remain." The morning after the wedding was quiet. The mansion, once buzzing with voices and music, now rested in stillness. Chairs stood empty in the garden, petals scattered across the grass like remnants of a storm. The air smelled faintly of champagne and roses, but the noise had gone. What remained was silence. I rose early, the deed still tucked beneath my pillow, and carried my cracked teacup downstairs. The kitchen was bathed in soft light, golden and forgiving. I brewed tea slowly, each movement deliberate, each breath steady. For the first time in weeks, I felt no weight pressing on my chest. Angela and David had not yet come down. I imagined them upstairs, their dreams of conquest fractured by truth. Perhaps they argued. Perhaps they sat in silence too, realizing how fragile their foundation had always been. That was not my burden to carry anymore. Emily arrived quietly mid-morning. her scarf pulled tight around her shoulders. She stepped into the kitchen, her eyes meeting mine with a softness I had come to cherish. "Are you all right?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Better than all right." She noticed the cup in my hand and touched the crack gently. "It held," she whispered. "Yes," I answered. So did I. We sat together, sipping tea, watching the sunlight shift across the counters. She didn't need to speak, and neither did I. Some bonds are woven in silence, and ours had been stitched thread by thread in moments like this. Later, I walked the garden paths alone. The roses Richard planted bent slightly under the weight of dew, their fragrance strong and sweet. I touched each bloom as I passed, whispering to them as if they were old friends. "We made it," I told them. "We're still here." At the oak tree, I paused. The swing David once loved swayed gently in the breeze. I closed my eyes, hearing his boyish laughter, remembering his small hands clutching the rope. My heart ached for the boy he had been, even as I released the man he had become. Love, I realized, does not disappear when it is betrayed. It simply changes shape. When I returned inside, I opened the drawer filled with my notes. Each one carried the voice I had almost lost. Silence can be strength. Truth endures. Timing is the sharpest weapon. I gathered them together, tied them with a thin ribbon, and placed them in a box beside Richard's letters. A record not of defeat, but of survival. By evening, the house felt lighter. I sat on the porch with my tea, the sky painted in shades of orange and lavender. Emily joined me, settling into the chair Richard had once built. We didn't speak for a long time. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was healing. Finally, I whispered, more to myself than to her. They tried to erase me, but I remained, and sometimes remaining is the loudest thing of all. Emily nodded, her eyes shining. As night fell, I carried my cup inside and placed it on the counter. The crack still glimmered faintly, a reminder that brokenness is not the end. It can be the beginning. Upstairs, I lay down to rest. The mansion creaked softly around me, its old wood alive with memory, with endurance, with truth. I whispered into the dark, to Richard, to myself, to anyone who might one day listen. I am still here. And with that, I let the silence hold me, not as absence, not as erasure, but as peace.